My name is Anthony Dissen. I'm an instructor in the School of Health Sciences here at Stockton. And my background is as a registered dietitian and community health educator, specifically focusing in plant-based nutrition. And so what I was asked to speak about, which was of course my favorite topic to speak about, is sort of what that means. What is plant-based nutrition? Why do people try to incorporate a more plant-based approach to the way they eat? What are the benefits that people are hoping to get from it? And how is it done in a way that is simple and maximizing of health and all the things that we're looking to get out of our lifestyle in terms of how they impact our health? So I have some info that I wanted to share, but as I always like to say with these sorts of events, I am much more interested in discussing what you are interested in. So please do not hesitate to take us down a completely different path or stay on a topic longer. I want to make sure that everybody who's come tonight gets out of tonight's talk what they were hoping to. So the idea of plant-based, and the term plant-based has really become a lot more popular in the last few years or so versus things like vegan, vegetarian, and so the question is, well, is there a difference between them? And kind of depending on who you ask, yes and no. The way that I use plant-based is building our daily diet, the foods that we eat, on predominantly, if not exclusively, plant-based foods. So whole fruits, whole vegetables, whole grains, beans, peas, lentils, nuts, seeds, etc. And then animal-based foods, things like eggs or dairy, meat, fish, poultry, pork, etc., would be either a very small, almost like more of a condiment or seasoning ingredient type approach to the food they cook, or completely absent at all. If that would be completely absent, then we would say this is a vegan diet, one that is completely free of animal products. Part of the reason why a lot of healthcare providers and people in general are really embracing this term plant-based is the term vegan sometimes extends beyond just food and might extend to things like whether I'm using hand cream that has lanolin in it that comes from sheep's wool, or does my belt have leather in it, or things of that nature. And sometimes different members of these communities can get a bit adamant about the V word and whether somebody is vegan or not vegan, and it tends to create a lot of coarseness. And so this term plant-based has really come up as a way just to look at the food and just to see, am I getting the majority or all of my calories from plant-based foods, as that is ideally what we're trying to do. One of the reasons why a lot of people are starting to gravitate towards a more plant-based diet is in recent years with people like Michael Pollan, who has written Omnivore's Dilemma and a few other books recently. He actually just had a little 4-part series come out on Netflix not too long ago. People have become very interested in going back to food, not just as a source of nutrition and calories and maybe impact on health, but as a approach to how they look at their culture, their life, and trying to make food beautiful again. And not in a way that is inaccessible, or not in a way that is expensive or pretentious or anything like that, but seeing the natural color and the color combinations, the things that can come out of these very humble ingredients has really seemed to spark a deep thread in a lot of people of being excited about their food and seeing their food as something beautiful, something more than just fuel. So the way that I approach it in my work is always looking at the health implications and the health consequences. And in the last couple decades or so, especially, I would even honestly within the last just 10 years, there's been a real explosion in the amount of research and study that is done to look at, well, if somebody is going to eat a plant-based diet, a majority or totally diet based on these foods, what are the health outcomes to that? Well, we know that most cases of heart disease, estimated somewhere around 95% of heart disease, is completely lifestyle-based. We know that about 95% of most cases of type 2 diabetes, lifestyle-based. About 90% of most types of cancers, lifestyle-based. And lifestyle is a combination of looking at nutrition, physical activity, do I smoke or not, do I get enough sleep, do I have clean water, all of these things that come together so many of our chronic illnesses, so many of the top causes of death in our country are completely lifestyle-based. Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn, who's one of the first doctors to really show heart disease reversal, and we'll see some of his pictures, but not just stopping the progression of heart disease, but actually getting those arteries to open back up again, showed that that was done purely through lifestyle, through just diet. Dr. Dean Ornish, who was the doctor before who did that, showed that with diet, moving, and a little bit of meditation each day, same thing, these arteries start to open, something that's never been done before in any other type of approach. And so it has really took the whole medical world quite by storm, and people have really started to see all of these other things. Stroke risk, high blood pressure, multiple sclerosis, lupus, arthritis, especially rheumatoid arthritis and other autoimmune types of conditions, respond incredibly well to the shift in diet to a more plant-based diet. And so it has really been something that people are looking to get these amazing benefits from. So what does that mean? The majority of our daily diet, if we were to try to emphasize a little more towards this plant-based idea, would come from what Dr. Neil Barnard calls those basic four: fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, peas, and lentils. I don't think that is earth-shattering news to anybody in terms of that these would be healthy foods. But the way that these foods are so often talked about is that, well, as long as you got a little fruit or a little veggie in there, you're doing the best you can. As opposed to, these are the foods that, if they're making up the majority of the calories we eat, the majority of the food we eat, this is where these benefits come from. As a secondary approach would be things like nuts and seeds being very helpful, but as we'll look, can be a little more what we call calorically dense. And especially when people's approach to lifestyle medicine is focused around trying to either maintain or achieve a particular weight status, overemphasis on some of these more processed or calorie-dense foods, as healthy as they can be a little counterproductive. And the reason I bring this up is many times when people try to become more vegan, vegetarian, plant-based, we end up just living on juices and avocados and coconuts, at which there's worse things a person could be doing. But then they will eventually hit a plateau of their health outcomes because there's going to be just a little more rich. And so going back to getting the majority of that plate being those foods. And then things like oils, animal foods, refined foods. It's not to say that they don't have any place at all, but these are optional. Nobody needs a lot of oil. Nobody needs really to eat processed food. Does that mean that if I put maple syrup in my oatmeal, I'm taking myself away from my health? Absolutely not. But these foods are basically secondary/optional, maybe just for some flavor or to help what some people think of as transitional, getting used to subtler flavors of sweet, subtler flavors of richness, that they can just help a person bring more of these foods in. I'm very much of the idea that if I have to, put a little olive oil to get somebody to get a gigantic salad, they're getting the salad in. And then as their taste buds change and develop over time, they may find their craving for those really rich, sweet, salty, savory type flavors start to become lower. Not because annoying dietitian said you got to eat less salt or eat less fat and this and that, but because in our brains and in our taste buds we're just getting used to these subtler flavors, where suddenly tasting something that is more processed, or even eating an animal-based food, one that might have used to have tasted quite good, tastes different now, right? It tastes a little metallic-y, or it's a little too intense of a sulfury flavor. And people's taste buds change as they get used to different flavors and different textures, different foods coming in. So my thought with it is always be that if I'm really loading up on those four, lots of beans and peas, lots of legumes, lots of fruits and vegetables, sweet potatoes, white potatoes, corn, quinoa, oats, there's not a lot of room for much else. These are filling foods. And so they tend to, by default, if I'm just telling myself or telling somebody else to just eat as many apples as you want, eat as many sweet potatoes as you want, eat as many, plates of a roasted squash that you want, whatever it might be, don't worry about the rest. It will just naturally start to replace some of those other foods in our diet because we feel satisfied or we feel full or happy with the foods we eat, as opposed to this more portion-controlled thing that doesn't work, deprivation type thing that absolutely doesn't work, because we're going against our bodies. If we're hungry and we don't eat, how does that lead to sustainable health changes? If I can sit down and eat a giant bowl of shredded wheat, fruit, pumpkin seeds, and big fruit salad on the side of it, and I'm full, and I'm not hungry for hours because of how full I am, that's because I physically feel full, not because I'm telling myself I'm not allowed to eat food next. So the idea with making these choices or coming into too much, the biggest problem that's really coming up with our animal-based foods right now, because a concern that is often raised when people talk about plant-based nutrition is, well, incorporating these animal-based foods has been a part of most cultural foods, most geographic regions. Why are we trying to take something away that's been part of our history for so much? Which I think is a very valid point. The thing with the animal-based foods are, if you look at the consumption that we have of them now, even to just 40, 50 years ago, it is so much. We eat so much more fish and eggs and dairy and meat and pork and poultry and all these different types of foods than we ever have before. Also, the way that these foods are raised now, they tend to be fed feeds that are more grain-based versus grass and insect-based, which changes the nutrition in them. A lot of these foods tend to be raised in rather stressful environments, and that really does actually change the nature and the chemistry of the food that when we consume it. And also, as this is going through, we are eating less plant-based food, less fiber than we ever have before, which very much changes the way that we digest our food as a whole. So the thought is not so much to say it's all or nothing, that I eat as many burgers as I want or I'm vegan tomorrow, but how do I just shift that scale a bit? Little less animal food, little more plant food. Little less animal food, little more plant food. And we find our happy medium. And most people find that they just crave and desire these animal-based foods less and less as they just get more attracted to these different flavors. So there's a researcher at Cornell named Dr. T. Colin Campbell. He wrote a book called The China Study, which some people may have heard of before. And he was really one of the first researchers, ironically started his research trying to show how dairy and other animal-based protein was necessary to help with third world hunger. What he found in his research was he was working in the East and found that there was a lot of incidence of liver cancer in children because there's a lot of issue in certain parts of East Asia with mold growing on things like peanuts and soybeans and other foods, and it releases this toxin that can cause cancer. But he found that all of the rich kids were the ones getting the liver cancer, and the children that were growing up in less affluent families had much lower rates. And what he found that was a huge difference between them was the amount of animal protein they ate. And so this kind of started him to look at, well, how much is too much? And what he found in studies was that if he brought animal protein down to about 5% of that daily calorie or less, there was not an initiation of cancer cell growth. If he brought it up to 20%, which is about what the average American eats on a daily basis, percentage of their calories from animal protein, this cancer growth started. If he switched, the non-growing group started to grow, or the growing group stopped. And he found that he could actually turn on and turn off the growth of these cancer cells based on just adjusting one thing, which was how much animal protein was in the diet. Now, this was done not at 0%, but 5%. So again, it's not to say that I can't have any animal-based food and hope to be healthy, but 5% of our calories from animal-based foods is pretty low, about an ounce or two or less a day. So most people find that that's so little that they just give it up in general, or that it might be something that I'm only really consuming maybe once a week, twice a week, something to that effect. So for most people, this is a real rough estimate, that's about 6 to 9 ounces of animal-based food a week. Not to get too numbers focused on it, but it's just more of an idea to see it really is quite a small amount. So maybe it's just a 1 or 2 meal a week, or it's just a small amount used as a seasoning in a soup or something like that. So the more that it was dropped, that is where on a genetic level these changes in health were started to be seen. So why not just adopt a plant-based diet right now? Why is there so much hesitation to do so? Well, we worry quite a lot about protein in our country, don't we? We're really obsessed with protein. Are we getting enough protein? Is there any protein in that? You need meat for protein. We talk so much about protein. There's an amazing book that was just published a couple years ago called Proteinaholic, which was written by a man named Dr. Garth Davis, who's a bariatric surgeon in Texas. And he's a bariatric surgeon that tries to talk his patients out of bariatric surgery by putting them on a plant-based diet instead. Or even the ones that do go for bariatric surgery, he still tries to get them as plant-based as possible because of the great outcomes they have. Protein is not something we lack in our diets or we lack in our world. As a human being, we only need about 10% of our calories to come from protein. The average American eats about 30 or more percent of our calories from protein. So we are resplendent in protein, and yet we still worry that we don't have enough protein. One of the concerns with too much protein in the diet, which is easy to do if I'm really eating a lot of cheese and milk, etc., is that it will start to affect us in a couple different ways. Protein stimulates growth, which is part of the reason why we worry about it so much, that we feel like we need all this protein to help with muscle and growth, and that's true. But other things in our bodies grow as well, especially body fat cells. Especially when we are adults, once we're done with maturity forward, the only 2 cells that are really left in our body that can grow without end are body fat cells or cancer cells. Since protein is this high stimulator for growth, and animal-based protein is especially stimulating for this growth, there is a lot of concern about how these high-protein diets impact our weight status and future cancer risk status. The World Health Organization, just a couple years ago, if you hadn't heard, declared processed meat, bacon, sausage, lunch meat, etc., as a class 1 carcinogen. That means it is in the same class of carcinogenicity, of cancer-causing effect, as asbestos and tobacco. Why? Part of it is it's such a processed food. It's high in salt, high in fat, no fiber, tons of protein, but that doesn't necessarily mean good health. One of the things I believe I first heard from Dr. Garth Davis was if you go into any GNC, half the stuff tells you it's high in protein and that's going to help you lose weight. And the other half of the store tells you it's high in protein and this will help you gain weight. So no matter what, if somebody stamps that word protein, we just automatically assume that must mean it's healthy and it's going to get us to our goals. There are protein-infused water bottles now, where you can buy water that has like a isolate protein in there. We're so obsessed with it. And it really does have effects when we go beyond that sweet spot of about 10% of our calories. Animal-based foods carry a lot of fat. One of the things that can then lead to is a lot of the concerns we have related to heart disease, which we typically think of with fat, but type 2 diabetes as well. Usually when people think of diabetes, our mind automatically goes to sugar. Gotta watch the carbs, cut the carbs, potatoes are bad, high protein, low carbohydrate diet. The reason why we develop type 2 diabetes is not because we have too many carbohydrates in our diet, but when we have too much fat, especially saturated fat, that is what prevents that insulin in our body from doing its job. So when people go on a very low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet, they actually find that their type 2 diabetes improves. In some cases, completely reverses. I have a former outpatient from years ago who calls it her insulin emancipation day, which was the last day she had to take a shot of insulin, because from that day onward, she has not needed any medication. Her blood sugar has been normal. And she has done that on a low-fat, high-carbohydrate, high white potato diet, and she no longer has the concerns we would expect for someone with type 2 diabetes. Another issue with animal-based foods is this process of biomagnification, which means the higher we are on the food chain, we accumulate those toxins and those compounds in the environment, pollution, etc., because a lot of them get stored in fat. So vegetables are very low in fat, fruit very low in fat, so they don't accumulate these toxins. Animal-based foods naturally have more fat, and they do accumulate them. So when we consume a lot of animal-based food, we're also consuming anything that animal breathed or drank that had any type of pollution or other types of toxic compound to it. There we go. So I am a firm believer that portion control and things like that is a myth, because that is not how our brains and our bodies are designed. We are designed to eat when we're hungry and eat to that point we feel full. So many of these different weight management, portion management types approaches are based on limiting calories, which if my goal is to achieve or maintain a particular weight, that would make sense. But the problem is our minds, our brains don't have a little calorie counter that said you ate 1,500 calories, you're full, you're done for the day. We go by how empty our stomach is. We go by how hungry we are. One of the great benefits to plant-based foods is they are what we call low calorically dense, which means pound for pound, they carry less calories than a more processed food or an animal-based food. So to give that as an example, fruits in general have about 300 calories per pound. So if you ate a pound of blueberries right now, you'd get about 300 calories, give or take. A pound of chicken, in general, has about 1,000 calories. So if I ate a pound of chicken right now, I'd get about 1,000 calories. My stomach feels a pound of food. So whether it was that pound of blueberries or a pound of chicken, it's a pound of food in our stomach, which means we get the same association of weight and fullness. So one of the great things with plant-based foods is they are not the types of foods we have to limit. Nuts, seeds, avocados, coconut, thoughtful of, because they are a little more rich. But fruits, vegetables, grains, peas, beans, corn, all these different things, they are impossible to overeat on. Think about if you took a big bag of clementines or oranges. How many would you eat before you just felt the need or the desire to stop? A couple. We don't sit and just gorge on clementines, although maybe that should be what we're gorging on. But is it easier to do that with potato chips? Is it easier to do that with chicken wings? Is it easier to do that with popcorn shrimp? These foods that are just more calorically dense, richer, saltier, sweeter, they stimulate that part of our brain that says keep eating. These foods, if we filled our whole plate up, by the time we were done with that plate, we'd be stuffed. We couldn't want to eat anymore. We'd be so full. There'd be so much volume of food in our stomach. So a wonderful thing with plant-based foods is they're the last thing we ever have to think, did I eat too much? Should I limit my portion on it? The more we focus on them, I find it just to be a liberating idea of just not having to think about, well, I'm still hungry, but I shouldn't eat more. That we should use these foods, again, if we're making them the majority of the food we eat, to just eat to our heart's content. So again, not to get too numbery, but if we look at the most recent data from the Centers for Disease Control, top leading causes of death in men and women are heart disease number 1, cancer number 2. For men, top leading cause of cancer death are lung cancer, prostate, and colorectal. For women, it's lung, breast, and colorectal. So we share, men and women, the exact same risk of heart disease and cancer, and specifically lung cancer, colon cancer, and hormonally driven cancers, like prostate and breast cancer. We know that nutrition and diet, especially a whole food, plant-based diet, addresses all of these. And I'll just take a quick break to say, if anybody would like these slides or any of this information, I will gladly send it your way. So if you're worried that you're not going to be able to remember all these things, if it's something you want to refer to in the future, excuse me, just let me know. But So Dr. Dean Ornish, this first physician to really look at lifestyle, what he found was, these may not look like much, but these show arteries that are constricted because they're plaque-ridden. They're atherosclerotic. They're tight. Blood's not coming through. They're causing heart attacks. They're causing chest pain and angina. All the issues that come. On each of these photos, these were taken by Dr. Esselstyn. But on the left side for each one, they're all narrow, like little skinny plant roots. And on the right side, completely open back up. No other lifestyle, no other nutritional has ever done this. A whole foods, low-fat, plant-based diet. In Dr. Esselstyn's program, completely vegan. In Dr. Ornish's program, not completely vegan, just mostly plants. So no matter what, whether one approach was used or the other, the answer was it was very little fat, and just a ton of fruits, vegetables, grains, beans, with animal food being very little or not present. We know that the number one risk for heart disease is cholesterol. How do we get so much cholesterol? Our bodies produce cholesterol in the presence of saturated fat. The number one source of saturated fat in the average American's diet comes from dairy foods. So we get these saturated fats from plant and animal sources, but animal-based sources are a major one. When we drop our intake of cholesterol and saturated fat, our total cholesterols drop. What has been found is that if you can keep your total cholesterol to 150 or less, statistically, you are what Dr. Esselstyn would call heart attack proof. Because in these large-scale studies that have looked at cholesterol and heart disease risk, once somebody or a group of people's total cholesterol was 150 or less, there were no incidences of heart disease, of heart attacks, of angina, of chest pain, of hypertension. So our current metrics, if you get your blood checked right now, most doctors are going to say keep it under 200. But people still get heart attacks and heart disease at levels around 200 or less. But once they get it below 150, which is very easy to do on a high-fiber, low-fat, plant-based diet, our number one cause of death, heart attack, heart disease, starts to go away. And people can get to this range in weeks. It's not something that takes years of time. It actually responds pretty quickly. This may not look like, just a bunch of arrows and things, but if you had to put this up to one word, it would be fiber. One of the great things about plant foods is they provide fiber, which is the only way we get fibers from them. So we all hear about fiber, it's good for your digestive system, isn't that nice? Fiber is such a key component to our digestive health, not just in digestive regularity. But has anybody come across about this idea of all the healthy bacteria in your gut and this idea of looking at your gut microbiome? It's something that's being looked at a lot recently. The little bacteria in our gut eat fiber for their food. That's actually how we feed them, is by giving them fiber. So when we are on a diet very high in fiber, we feed all those helpful bacteria in our colon. When people go on probiotics to supplement with that bacteria, the problem is the second they stop supplementing, whatever their bacterial, let's say, strains were before they started supplementing goes right back to it. But when we feed that bacteria through fiber, we produce our own healthy probiotics that don't go away as long as we keep feeding them fiber. So what does that mean if we have a lot of this fiber being digested and fermented within the body? Well, first thing that happens is they produce a lot of short-chain fatty acids, which are powerfully protective against colon cancer. We actually want our colons to be ever so slightly acidic pH, because it prevents and helps to protect against the growth of these colon cancers. And they are looking now to see if they can even help reduce polyp growth as well, but at least we know for colon cancer. Without fiber, those bacteria can't produce those fatty acids, and so nothing gets made, and you can't supplement that through. So high fiber diets create all this lovely bacteria, and they produce all this wonderful fatty acid that actually protects the colon. Second thing that happens is that we get these hormonal shifts and these hormonal changes because fiber is very thick and viscous when it gets into our colon. So not only do we get the feeling of fullness and the feeling of satiety from it, but neurologically, chemically, our colon communicates up to our brain and says, you're done. So hormonally, we feel more normal levels of hunger and satiety. When we try to just starve ourselves to a weight-based plan, we're not getting, if anything, we're getting the opposite. We're getting that constant desire to eat, and then we blame ourselves and say, if only I had more willpower, or I was stronger. We always just assume the fault is our own. And it's because these plans completely ignore our basic biology. When we have a lot of fiber moving through, we have this lovely little cycle of the bacteria gobble up the fiber, pump out these short-chain fatty acids. The bacteria communicate up to our brain and say, thank you for feeding me. You can stop eating because I'm getting the fiber I need. The thick, viscous nature of that fiber also allows us to feel full. And since fiber is an undigestible amount of carbohydrate, we get no calories from it. So we naturally bring our caloric intake down without limiting the volume of food we eat. We keep our volume of food high so we feel satisfied, but we eat less calorie in the process. So many people now are turning to this idea, again, of caloric density, which I love this picture because to me this says it all. If you look at what the amount of food you'd have to eat to, let's say, get 400 calories of beef, of canola oil, or non-starchy vegetables. They're all 400 calories, but one of those is really filling the stomach up a lot more than the other. And it's not to say, oh, that means I need to live on a diet of nothing but vegetables. But if I'm trying to get this combination of maximum fullness without it being an excessive amount of calorie, the more we focus on these plant-based foods, we hit that magical sweet spot without ever needing to say how many tablespoons or cups or whatever it is that it might be. So this chart was put up by another dietitian named Jeff Novick. And again, to me, numbers, they don't really mean too much, other than to show this is per pound, what a pound of vegetables looks like. How many calories would it give? A pound of fruit, a pound of unrefined complex carbohydrates. Those would be things like whole grains, oats and brown rice and whole wheat pasta and corn and quinoa and all these different things, as well as starchy vegetables like butternut squash, sweet potatoes, white potatoes, parsnips, and then beans, peas, and lentils. Versus 1,000 calories per pound is what we get from most animal-based food, about 1,400 calories per pound for refined carbohydrates like white bread, white rice, white flour, etc. All the way up to oil, which is 4,000 calories a pound. Does that mean I can't ever eat a drop of oil again? Absolutely not. But if I put oil on everything, everything is rich in that way. Nuts and seeds, which are powerhouses of nutrition, are 2,800 calories a pound. That doesn't make them unhealthy. It doesn't make them fattening. But if I'm picking a snack for myself, and so I make myself a baggie of walnuts because, well, I gotta get my protein in, I'm getting in a lot more calories than if I picked a couple bananas, or I could probably eat a whole pineapple for the amount of calories that little sandwich bag of walnuts would give. So it's just about, if the more we shift towards that lower end of the spectrum here, the more that, again, these fruits, vegetables, grains, beans are making up the largest proportion of our diet, we are getting very large volumes of food, a lot of heavy weight of food, very little calorie, very little caloric density to these foods. So these are kind of purposely exaggerated just to kind of show the difference. So I could eat half a Cliff Bar for 100 calories, or I could eat 7 heads of romaine lettuce. It doesn't mean that when I'm having an energy bar craving, I'm going to eat a 7 head of romaine lettuce salad and say it's the same thing. But so many people will eat that half a Cliff Bar and say, well, that was my snack, or not too much, versus, well, why not make myself a gigantic, huge vegetable salad, or not let myself get hungry where I feel the need for the snack because I made a really big vegetable dish for myself to feel full. I forgot to bring it. My little teeny individual serving size of Pringles is about 360 calories. That's the amount of 3 large Jersey ears of corn. And most people in the summertime will eat maybe 1 or 2 ears of corn and stop because they're just more filling. They just hit you to that point where you feel satisfied. Where this little, I'm not talking about a big sleeve of Pringles. I mean the little 99-cent ones that are near the checkout. Most people would eat and say, "Where's my next snack?" Because I ate 12 little wisps of air that don't make anybody feel full. I could eat a slice of pizza, or I could eat about 11 tomatoes. So I could take my 7 heads of romaine and my 11 tomatoes and make a world's biggest salad that would have less calories than a slice of pizza and a bite of a Cliff Bar, which is going to leave me feeling more full. Spring rolls, egg rolls, too, tend to be about 500 calories. I could eat 3 large yams. If I could even finish eating 3 large yams for the same amount of calorie, most of us will eat the egg rolls and then our meal on top of it and not feel 500 calories fuller because they're so tiny. It's such a small amount of space. And so again, it's not to say that we're supposed to live off of these really low calorie dense things like tomatoes and lettuce and things like that. But if I'm really bringing them into my diet, sweet potatoes, corn, cucumbers, rice, starchy fruits like bananas and mango and papaya and things of that nature. Even our good friend walnuts, a cup of walnuts is 800 calories. I could eat 4 cans of beans for 800 calories. And it's not that walnuts are an unhealthy food, but it's really easy to eat a handful of walnuts and get about half a cup, about 400 or 500 calories there. Could I eat 2 cans of beans and just keep eating them and eating them? They just naturally stimulate that satiety, that full feeling within us, without having to say, was that too many beans? Was that too many carbs? Was that too many calories? That, to me, plant-based nutrition has always been just such a source of freedom from that type of thinking that we don't have to worry about it. Or my absolute favorite, for 2 scoops of ice cream, I could eat 2 pineapples and still a banana on top of it, just to get to the same amount of calories. Would I even finish half the pineapple before I'm full? So again, purposely exaggerated. I know it's kind of silly, but maybe I lied. Maybe this one's my favorite. Just so much food, and we would look at this and say that the hamburger would be healthier because it has protein, and I shouldn't eat the mango because it's too much sugar. You know, it's just this cultural language that's been sort of subliminally put in our minds. It completely skews us away from these obvious benefits of why would we ever limit the amount of this fresh produce in our diet. A recent study showed that the #1 dietary choice that was associated with a shorter longevity, a shorter lifespan, was not enough fruit in the diet. Fruit, if white potatoes are the most evil food out there, fruit's right under it because we get so worried about sugar and carbohydrates and things like that. #1 risk factor for developing diabetes, not enough fruit in the diet. So the same foods that most doctors, dietitians would say to limit, these are the foods that actually are associated with the lowest rates of these diseases or these health risks. Incredible. So with weight management, heart disease management, we get this high fiber, low fat, high plant-based diet is very helpful. But what about some of these types of cancers? How does nutrition have anything to do with lung cancer? Isn't that just smoking? Well, we know that grilled meat gives off a lot of very carcinogenic fumes. Part of the reason we know this is because restaurant workers who are constantly being exposed to all the fumes that come from grilling meat, grilling chicken, grilling ribs, have much higher rates of lung cancer. And people who live near restaurants that grill these foods also tend to have higher incidences of lung cancer. Because when meat and fat is grilled and it hits that heat and fumes, it creates something called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are just these very carcinogenic compounds that we breathe into our lungs and it causes damage to that tissue. We know that, again, processed meats like bacon, sausage, lunch meat, etc., in addition to their colon cancer risks, have also been associated with lung cancer and bladder cancer and pancreatic cancer and leukemia and kidney cancer. If nothing else from this evening is find a way to get the processed meat away, because when this first came out from the WHO, they had the same reaction that 30, 40, 50 years ago they got when they said tobacco is bad. It initially hits a brick wall because even my doctor smokes, so why is my doctor going to tell me not to smoke? Well, even my doctor eats bacon, so why is my doctor going to tell me not to eat bacon? So it takes some time for this information to work its way into our kind of cultural acceptance. It's estimated that almost 3/4 of all colon cancer are completely preventable. What's amazing about colon cancer is, again, with the healthy bacteria in our gut, even if somebody is prone to developing polyps, polyps don't ever have to turn into cancer if they don't get exposed to these mutating agents. Diets high in fat cause the liver to release a lot of bile. And when bile is metabolized by the bacteria in our gut, it creates what are called these secondary byproducts, and those byproducts can mutate polyps in the lining of our digestive system to produce colon cancer. Again, the colon is protected by those more acidic pHs that we get when bacteria is fermented. Excuse me. And when meat is cooked, when animal tissue is cooked, it produces what are called heterocyclic amines. This chemical reaction that occurs between heat, protein, and carbohydrate in that meat. If somebody were to consume chicken, the most carcinogenic way to eat that chicken would actually be grilled. And we are all eating our weight in grilled chicken every summer because that's what everybody tells us is so heart healthy. And not only does chicken have just as much saturated fat and cholesterol as most red meat, but the grilling action actually makes it that much worse. So if somebody really wanted to eat some chicken, it would be better to put it in a soup or to cook it in some sort of moist cooking environment, because it doesn't get that high hit of heat. So that high exposure of muscle to heat really dramatically increases the risk that we associate with it with some of these types of cancers. For men, our risk of prostate cancer shoots way, way up the more animal fat and animal protein we eat. And men are especially marketed to about, what is manly, lots of steak, salads are for wimps, you eat your life and, cheese and lunch meat and all these different things. And we know that they dramatically increase our risk for prostate cancer. Egg and poultry intake in particular was associated with the most lethal types of prostate cancer, because eggs in particular are really high in something called choline, which is associated with some of these hormonally driven cancers. For breast cancer, more has been studied with breast cancer and diet, but again, we know that high intake of saturated fat drives up cholesterol. Cholesterol is a precursor for estrogen. So for a lot of these estrogenic cancers, the more we lower our cholesterol, the more protected we are against estrogen-driven cancers. Dairy food is very high in estrogen. How does any mammal produce milk? It has a lot of estrogen flowing through its system. And we actually consume dairy estrogen every time we consume these dairy products. So women who eat the least amount of dairy tend to have the least amount of exposure to environmental estrogens. But what do we all blame estrogen for? Soy. We get really worried about tofu, we get really worried about tempeh and soybeans. There's no estrogen in a soybean because it's a plant. It has no mammalian estrogen. If anything, studies show that normal consumptions of soy are actually quite protective against breast cancer. And my very admittedly terrible analogy for it is if you walk into a Starbucks and you see somebody there who just plops their computer down, doesn't order anything, but they're taking up a space at the counter while they write their screenplay, that's soy estrogen. They come into your cell and they just set up shop, but they don't create any change. It's a really bad analogy, I know. But it doesn't order anything, it's not ordering it, it doesn't create any action in that cell, and it prevents somebody else from sitting there and ordering something. So I know it's bad, I know. But these soy foods are actually quite protected because since they don't actually contain estrogen, just these compounds that kind of look like estrogen, they can combine onto the same sites on our cells. So they take up space, but they're just on their laptops. They're not changing anything in the cell, and they're very, very protective. If anybody has any better comparison to think of, please, I'm all up for suggestions. Even for something like back pain. High levels of cholesterol are associated with higher rates of lower back pain. The number one cause of debilitation in the country is chronic low back pain. As we lower our cholesterol, one of the great things that happen is our blood gets more liquidy and aqueous and watery, and it flows better. And once blood and oxygen are able to flow to our discs better, it prevents the inflammation, the degeneration that can cause a lot of this chronic back pain. Same thing is true for arthritis. The more our blood is watery and oxygen rich and nutrient rich, it helps take that inflammation away. If anybody's heard of these omega-3s and omega-6 fats before, we get a lot of omega-6 fat from animal food. Because since most cows, most chicken, even most fish now are fed corn, corn is very high in omega-6 fat. So if I eat corn on the cob, I get a little omega-6 fat. But if I eat a salmon that's been eating corn its entire life, I'm getting all of that omega-6 fat concentrated in my little piece of salmon. So as those fat ratios get thrown off, they can also trigger some of the inflammation that we deal with arthritis, osteoarthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, and a lot of these inflammatory conditions. So it all comes back to just getting in these colorful, inexpensive, half these foods you don't even have to cook, so you don't have to have any type of great skill in the kitchen to eat a peach or to open up a can of beans. You know, it's so convenient. And most cultural foods are really based on these. So something that a lot of different organizations and different groups have done is to try to rediscover the cultural underpinnings to their diets and finding how plant-based they really are. The Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine in Washington, D.C. has been trying to do a lot with some Native American populations, which are ravaged by type 2 diabetes and other chronic illnesses, to get them to actually rediscover their natural, traditional, ancestral means of cooking, which tends to focus on squash, corn, beans, these plant-based, low-fat, high-fiber foods, and are seeing some really amazing changes in these populations. So the overall, based on the current evidence we have from all this different research that gets done, is that the more fiber, the better. If we can aim for about 40 to 50 or more grams of fiber a day, that's wonderful. The average American gets less than 15 to 20. So just getting more fiber in will help feed that gut bacteria. If I'm thinking to myself, look, I can eat a little less meat or a little less cheese or a little less eggs or dairy, but I don't want to give it all up, just focus on the less. What's the least amount that I can comfortably eat today? And then tomorrow I'll figure it out from there. But the lower we can get it, it really changes the way that some of these genes are being expressed and other functions in the body are happening. Keeping our saturated fat as low as possible, again, number one source of saturated fat is dairy. If you really think about it, most people don't like milk. Most people really don't like dairy. But if I add some sugar and chocolate to the milk, or if I turn it into ice cream, or I turn it into a flavored yogurt or cheese or something like that, so we don't tend to crave a lot of milk as it is. But if we manipulate it, if I put a lot of salt in there, it'll start to taste pretty good. So the more we can get that saturated fat down, for all those different types of cancers, for heart disease, for all these different functions, lower back pain, arthritis, so helpful. And just loading up on deeply colored, beautiful fruits, vegetables. If the only fruit you like is apples, just buy apples. You don't have to eat kale if you don't really want to eat kale. It's a great food, but we don't have to eat it if you don't want it. Romaine lettuce, like in your salad, is a wonderfully healthy green. iceberg lettuce is actually a really nutrient-dense green. We always kind of make fun of it and say that it's just water. There's actually a lot of nutrition in ice, so if that's the only way you'll eat a salad, make the biggest iceberg lettuce salad you can, and just bring it in your diet in any way that you can. As much as possible, finding a way to shift our focus away from some of these deep-fried foods, grilled, char-broiled foods, because again, they can really have their own issues associated with them, whether they're plant-based or otherwise. And as much as possible, if nothing else, getting those processed meats as little to none in the diet, because they definitely are the highest on that list of risk factors for so many of these different things. But to me, I think the easiest way to come about it is just to focus on the plants. Getting in as much fruit, much veg, much bean, peas, lentils, whole grains, starchy vegetables. The rest kind of just starts to take care of itself from there. Once people start to do that, we all eventually will hit some plateau, whether our goal is related to blood sugar or weight or cholesterol levels, and then maybe some more finer tuning needs to happen. But just bringing those plants in, letting them take up this biggest space in your stomach, the rest just falls like dominoes. It's not as complicated as so many plans and books and things out there try to make it. It's just the more plants, the better. Everything else starts to take care of itself after that. So if anybody, again, would like any information from this after this evening sent their way, or has questions after this evening or resources, never hesitate to shoot an email out. Let me know what I can do.